Dublin, Ireland is a remarkably historic city, with loads of character, architectural beauty, and lots of green space. But today, Dublin, which has a population of 1.5 million people, has a surprisingly limited electric transit system. Fortunately, with the Irish economy booming and Dublin growing rapidly, there are plans to dramatically expand the rapid transit system, more than doubling it in size, as well as extending it to all corners of the city. When you combine that with the little appreciated and surprisingly interesting existing transit network, it makes for a great story. So let's explore that story and take a look at Dublin. Welcome to RM Transit, a channel about public transportation systems around the world. Consider supporting on Patreon to help me bring you more videos. Before I dive into Dublin's transport, I do want to mention a couple of basics. Dublin is on the east side of Ireland, about 500 kilometers northwest of London, and it's split north to south by the River Liffey, which runs through the city centre. The city has a pretty substantial airport, which is located about 9 kilometers north of the city centre, and 2 major rail stations. Houston, which is south of the river on the west side of the central city, and focused more on intercity services, as well as Connolly, which is north of the river on the east side and focused on suburban services. The backbone of the Dublin transport system, and probably its best known element, is Luas, which is a fairly large tram network with 2 different lines, nearly 70 stops, and over 42 kilometers of track. The trams used on the system are all Citadis units from Alstom, and some of them have a really funky design that combines the long segments from the Citadis Spirit or Dualis with the shorter segments seen on other Citadis trams. Trams are powered by a standard 750 volt DC overhead power line and run on standard gauge tracks. The red line uses trams that are up to 40 meters long, while the green line uses even longer trams of up to 50 meters. And Dublin's kind of interesting because it's one of those select cities that actually added segments to some of its trams after purchasing them to lengthen them for more capacity. The 2 Luas lines are biased to the west and south of the city, with shorter legs to the north and the east, and they cross in the city centre at grade at O'Connell Street, the most important street in the centre, with the east-west red line seeing 2 tracks which are together, and the north-south green line having its tracks separated onto 2 different streets. In the city centre in particular, the green line has a lot of mixed traffic operation, but things aren't too bad. The design of these streetscapes and the various rail segments is actually quite sophisticated and reminds me of different alignments in Paris and Stuttgart, with a number of different road design elements that passively prioritize the trams over private cars, and frankly, it's surprising they fit trams in here anyways. Beyond the city centre to the east, the red line has a short on-street branch which runs into one of Dublin's waterfront districts, which is creatively named Docklands, a name that no other English-speaking city has ever given to a waterfront district. There's also a super tiny, stubby little branch that goes to Connolly Station, which provides great connections to mainline rail. To the west of the city centre, the red line stops in front of Houston and then continues westwards on a number of different dedicated alignments, which are quite nice. There's also tons of lovely green track, few road crossings, and a really cool segment along the Grand Canal. At the very uniquely designed, almost tent-like Bellegarde stop, there are 3 platforms and the line splits in 2 to head in 2 different directions. A branch to the south which travels to a mall and has a very cool section that runs under some flats, and a branch to the west which travels by industrial areas, some newly developed suburbs, and by an old open pit mine. Ultimately, the line ends up 13 kilometers from central Dublin, which is pretty substantial. The green line is really interesting because it's rather distinct from the red line, since a huge chunk of it runs on old suburban rail alignments. And while the red line has branches at both ends, the green line is a straight shot. The leg north of the city centre isn't too long and deposits trams next to a suburban rail station, while the leg to the south is much longer. The southern portion of the green line has various elevated and below grade sections which help hop it over and under various obstacles. Maintaining speed through selective grade separations like this is a really nice design touch. Once it exits the suburban rail alignment, the green line ends up feeling a lot like the red line, a nice modern tram on dedicated alignments that manages to work its way 15 kilometers south of central Dublin. Now, the good of Luas is the great design as well as the numerous transit-oriented developments and huge office parks near a lot of the stops. Trams do not only run next to and in the middle of roads as well, and in fact, vanishingly little of the network is actually in the median of a street, contrasting with light rail in other places. I'll also say that the way that Luas is integrated with various suburban developments is a really nice guide on how to do a site plan that integrates trams through it, so that trams aren't traveling along a road, but kind of across the site without interacting too much with traffic, and thus keeping them fast. Though I will say that all of the winding and weaving of the routes, as well as the fact that the trams oddly have a top speed of only 70 kilometers per hour, means Luas, which means speed in Irish Gaelic, ends up feeling like a very ironic name, especially in the city centre. Despite this and a number of different park and ride lots, Luas is a really nice system and manages to move over 100,000 daily riders, which is really respectable. I also think it has a lot to teach tram systems in other parts of the world, though in the city center in particular, it could probably benefit from some more grade separation, like you see in many German cities such as Karlsruhe. There are a number of plans being kicked around to expand Luas as well, although none of them are currently under construction and it'll probably be some time. The Green Line is meant to be extended both north and south, and a new line is supposed to be built to the Lucan area, which is a built-up urban area straight west of central Dublin, which doesn't get great rail service on the main lines. This route would actually have an interesting shared section about midway along the Red Line, and then it would go into the city center on a new east-west alignment through the south of the city, of course also connecting to the Green Line. Now, augmenting Luas's lines to the west, south, north, and east of the city center is the rather underrated DART system, which does have an incredibly North American name, see San Francisco or Dallas, and which features electric rail services along the national rail network, running along the coastline and across central Dublin, a la Thameslink. The DART services, like the rest of Ireland's national rail system, runs on 1600mm tracks. However, unlike the rest of the national rail network, DART is electrified at 1500 volts DC, and has some very nice electric multiple unit trains, some of which have been running since the 80s, that provide a frequent all-day and weekend service and run it up to 100 km per hour. The whole of the current DART route is very coastal, and the southern portion in particular is incredibly scenic, with a single track line popping in and out of tunnels along the rocky coastline. However, despite this rather quaint right-of-way, the rest of the line is lean and mean, with few grade crossings and an elevated viaduct through central Dublin, which cuts across blocks and runs past apartment buildings into 3 through platforms at Dublin Connolly, that of course can't help but remind me of Manchester Piccadilly. Now, I must say, as an outsider, it can be easy to miss, but my favorite station on DART has to be Dublin Pierce, which is an incredibly cool looking station and a wonderful welcome to central Dublin. To the north of the city, the line is in trenches, with some rather distinctive ramps which travel down to the platforms. A little further to the north, the line splits, with an eastern branch to Howth and a northern branch to Malahide. I should probably point out at this point that you can pay for all of the transit in Dublin with the Leap card, which covers most transit across the country and is run by TFI, which is the creatively named Transport for Ireland. Now, if DART is underrated, DART Plus, the future plan for the DART network, is supremely underrated, because it's set to electrify much of the rail network around Dublin, introducing more DART-style services while also introducing new electric multiple unit trains. Existing commuter diesel lines to the north and northwest of the city will be electrified and made frequent, while yet another service from the city's north, as well as Houston to its west, will also be electrified, expanding DART from a single suburban line to an entire regional network. There's also a plan to add a 4th through platform at Connolly, which would allow for an operation similar to Berlin Hauptbahnhof, where you have trains stopping at either one of 2 platforms in each direction, allowing for longer dwell times. What I find funny about DART is just how much it has in common with Metro Trains Melbourne out of Australia. Both networks have 1500 volt DC overhead lines, both networks have 1600mm Victorian gauge tracks, and both networks will be filled up with Alstom Extrapolis trains, the Alstom Extrapolis being the future model that will be introduced to DART. What will be unique about Dublin's trains is that some of them will actually be fitted with batteries. This will allow electrified services to roll out before electric wires actually go up on certain parts of the network, and I actually think this is a pretty good use of battery trains, if there ever was one. That being said, some inspiration from Melbourne could probably be beneficial for reorganizing the various Western rail services, since most lines will not serve Docklands, while the line that will run to Docklands will have kind of poor access to the city centre. The solution, given Melbourne, is probably a looping tunnel that adds several more stations throughout the city centre, as well as connections at Houston and Connolly. As it turns out, something like this has been proposed in the past, but sadly it hasn't ever made it off the drawing board, which it clearly should. The special sauce that ties everything together, and the project I'm probably most excited for, is the planned MetroLink line, which, yet again, is the name of so many transit services in the English-speaking world, but would be a 3-car automated metro system that would run north-south through the city west of the existing DART line, connecting a ton of different stations and services up. The line will also mean a connection finally to Dublin Airport and a fast link north-south across the city centre to complement Luas. The line, which is reminiscent of some of the ones we see in France, for example in Lyon, will use a single bore tunnel with mostly cut-and-cover stations, which is a logical design. And it'll travel from north of the airport to the airport, the city centre, and beyond to the south, connecting all of the various DART services up as well as Luas. Now, originally the idea was to extend the line along the green Luas route, which would convert the suburban rail segments from tram to metro. And with some pretty nice foresight, these sections were actually planned with the structures required to also handle metro trains. But with that said, I think that this conversion to metro probably shouldn't ever happen, because unless the demand is so high that the trams can't handle it, it will force people traveling from the south of the city to transfer to get into the city center, unless that is a new 8-kilometer tram segment is built, which it could be, but that seems unlikely. What's amazing is that once you put all of Dublin's criminally underreported transit builds together, you realize that there's actually a pretty impressive plan to expand electric transit in the region. And with loads of different interconnections and tons of capacity for the future, I actually think it's a pretty good plan. I think it may be time for me to start planning a trip to Dublin. Thanks for watching.